oh my God, number 21. This is the last episode of 2023. While people are just joining in, and big welcome to everybody from wherever you're joining. Let us know. We want to hear from you. You know, you have that chat on the right side of your screens. So feel free to use it and let us know where you're joining from. Share your, I don't know, LinkedIn profiles, where you feel like you want. If you want us to touch base on anything in particular, just go ahead and do that. Just let us know. You also have that emoticon symbol down at central of the bottom bar, so you can let us know how you're feeling in a more creative way. But without too much of the housekeeping stuff, I would like to welcome today Louise Worsley, who is, who graciously accepted the invitation to have this conversation today, which is about stakeholder-led project management. And that's a really interesting topic, and a topic that many of you have mentioned before that are interested to hear more about. And you know, what better way of having this insight than from Louise? She's an expert in a lot of things, and she will let us know about that. But I think that the stakeholder part is one of her strong suits. So thank you, Louise, for joining us today, marking our very last episode of the year. We'll give it a bit of a Christmassy vibe as well. And if you'd like to say a few words about yourself, I don't want to take that away from you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. It's funny you say about being an expert. You know, when I was young, and my mum used to ask me, "What do you want to be?" I used to say, "I want to be an expert." I used to drive her around the bend. You know, not a doctor, not an engineer. I used to say I want to be an expert. And it turns out if you pick a subject that's really small, you can be an expert. So yeah, but I'm here in Cape Town. So we've got the north in Canada where you are, Ilinka, where it's cold, and here we are down in Cape Town where we've been 34 this week. So Christmas is slightly different here, and as we were saying, stakeholders are slightly different here. But yeah, so I'm really delighted to talk about stakeholders, and maybe a good place to start is why on earth I picked this subject. Would that be a good place to start?
That would be a great place to start, of course.
Okay, fantastic. Well, you know, I often get inspired by my students. I teach on the master's program here at University of Cape Town, and we were doing work on success stories that they've shared. And why don't we learn from projects? Because the truth is we don't. And I think you've done one about this actually, Alinka, haven't you? Haven't you done some stuff on how do we learn from projects as well? I had one of my students who went back to her organization to see about how they were learning from their projects, and she was in a very big retail group, and what she found was that every project pretty much did have a post-implementation review report, which is very good, isn't it? So but what she then did, and this is where her research really stalled, is she went away to find out how many times these reports had been used. And there was only one project where the post-implementation review report had ever been accessed. So that's how we started. And we wanted to make a approach to sharing success stories in South Africa. So I worked with a lady who was very passionate about this, Linky van der Merwe. I met her at a conference. Just shows you networking is great at conferences. And we started to collect stories about projects in South Africa, in a little few in America, quite a few in Europe. And we did like you're doing, Alinka. We talked to people on big projects, things like Eurostar in the UK. Here in Cape Town, it was 2010 when the FIFA World Cup was on. So we looked at the mass road transport system that was put in place for the FIFA World Cup. And we talked to people and we asked them to talk about their projects. And then we started to publish them in our local project magazines. But what really got me, I was talking to really technical people, engineers on roads. I was talking to IT managers. I was talking to train specialists. And every project I looked at, in the end, you could see that success, whether it was successful or failed, almost always came down to the stakeholders, how well they've been engaged with or how badly they've been engaged with. So that for me was, and so many of my stories turn out to be about stakeholders. So that's why I started to get worried about stakeholders, or why get interested in stakeholders, because I don't know if your audience would agree, but so often it's those that trip us up in projects. What do you think, Alinka?
I think we don't really know how to differentiate who our stakeholders are.
Yeah, yes.
That is what I
Yes.
see in my experience. I think that the terminology is very familiar in project management, but I think that the way you choose them or identify them is probably is lacking a bit of knowledge. And I think that's where, you know, your book and your research is, you know, makes the difference, because it deeps dive into that gray area.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, there were a number of worry points for me when I looked at stakeholder engagement. I mean, I went out and did, because I'm in academia, went out and looked at every definition of stakeholders, and there's hundreds of them. And the PMI one is fantastic. It's good. And it basically talks about how a stakeholder is somebody who is impacted by, involved with, thinks they're a stakeholder, in the now or in the future. And that's a really great statement. And it's one I use with my students. But the problem with it is it almost says everybody's a stakeholder. And that's a problem, because the reason we do this stuff, the reason we use differentiators like what's a stakeholder, is to help us identify the appropriate management approach. Now, if everybody you're going to talk with is a stakeholder, how does that help us? And that was my first worry point. How do we help project managers get to understand that there are different types of stakeholders, and that there are different types of management processes we apply? So if you go back to the old way that stakeholders were described in things like PMI and also APM and some of the IPMA type definitions, where they talk about everybody being a stakeholder, including the team, by the way, including you as the project manager. You're a stakeholder apparently too, including the board, including the sponsor. And there's a problem with that, because the truth is that when you're dealing with a team, there's a very well-defined process for managing teams. It's called team management. When you're dealing with your board or your sponsors, there's a very well-defined process in that, which is called governance. And when you are dealing with yourself, there's a defined process which is talked about, which is emotional intelligence and all this kind of stuff. So we were overusing that word stakeholders, and it didn't help us as much as we wanted to. So I used to teach to my students that a stakeholder is somebody who is related, is that long definition, is influenced by or interested in your project, and that you don't manage them through some other management process, teams, governance, whatever it is. But nobody got that. So I got that wrong. So we decided, or I decided, that I had to find a simpler way. And I describe in my book that you can differentiate your stakeholders as basically a group which are role-based and a group which are agenda-based. So role-based stakeholders, they are easy. They are the ones that you can identify a specific role with respect to your project. And it may be a role they're occupying now, it may be a role they're occupying in the future. But it's a role with respect to your project. It might be they're a subject matter expert. It might be that they are a member of your team. It might be they're your sponsor. And with those types of stakeholders, what we worry about is, have we all understood our roles? I know what I think you're doing, but do you agree with what you think you're doing? And does that other person over there know what you're doing? So around role-based stakeholders, we see a lot of tools and techniques around ensuring that we have created a common understanding of what we're trying to achieve in the project. And role-based stakeholders are relatively easy to find. You can use checklists for them. You can use just a list of people involved, your OBS. But then this other group of stakeholders, agenda-based stakeholders. Now, they're different. They don't necessarily have a specific role with respect to your project, but they may feel really passionately about it. And because of that agenda and because of that passion, they can have a serious impact upon your project. So one of the projects that I interviewed people about in South Africa was is the new road transport system, in which we were going to put in new shiny buses. And the taxi drivers in Cape Town and South Africa, we have these little minibus taxi drivers, and they're lots of fun. They're really scary. They're quite dangerous, and they hog the roads, and everybody's scared of them. But they're really fantastic because they shove people in. They can get people around, but they are like a mafia. So they do what they want to do, really. So the city of Cape Town had got this problem that they needed to change these taxi drivers so that they would not be able to run on certain roads. They would reduce the number of taxi drivers. They would introduce more formal busing services. And this was largely in the early days to do with FIFA and all the tourists coming in. Nowadays, it's our new way of putting people around. Now, the taxi drivers are a fantastic example of agenda-based stakeholders. There were hundreds and thousands of them. They don't have a role with respect to the project, but I tell you what, they are really, really aggressively interested in the project. And those are the kind of people that often we find difficult to, first of all, identify, because often they hide from us. So they'll hide because they don't want you to know, and then they come out and jump into your project. And the other thing is that we have to understand what their specific agenda is if we're going to be able to engage with them appropriately. So, and those agendas can be quite difficult to find out. And that means between role-based stakeholders and agenda-based stakeholders, we use very different tools and techniques. Very different tools and techniques. What I'm going to put you on the spot here, Alenka. What kind of tools do you use to identify stakeholders at the moment?
Usually it's a team effort. Some actually to ask you if you find in your research that the project manager identifies the stakeholders by him or herself, or is it more of a team effort where you can have I guess just a brainstorming session with some of the members of the team? I find that works well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we know about stakeholder identification is that you should never do it on your own. Should never do it on your own, because you're often, as a project manager, not the most appropriately positioned to identify stakeholders. So doing like you're doing, going out to your team is good. But when we're identifying role-based stakeholders, it's good we can use our teams, we can use checklists. PMOs can help us. They can give us checklists of who you should traditionally involve in your projects, who's going to be the sponsor, who's going to be the SME. And those checklists can help us. When we are trying to identify agenda-based stakeholders, we need to go external to our own team. We need to find out those people who are going to influence us who aren't in the project. And we also need to consider those types of stakeholders who might appear further down the line. So one of the techniques that we start to use there is we use things like power and interest grids, which you've probably seen, which is classic 2x2. How influential are they? How much power do they have? And that helps us because it begins to give us a feel for what their salience is, how important they might be to us. Because somebody who's got low power and low influence is less important. That's rubbish. We'll use different types of engagement approaches than somebody who has high power and high influence. So we're much more likely to look for involvement processes for the high power, high influence than for the low power, low influence, where you might just use communication processes, keep them informed. So, and then as we get into those, I mean, like as we go into complex programs and projects, then we need to use more complex analysis techniques. And so PMI, for example, I don't know if it actually uses the term, but the model it's using is based upon a salience model, which is looking at how salient stakeholders are in terms of power, urgency, and interest. Might have got the third one wrong. So that's looking at 3 types of things. But all the time, what we are trying to identify is how much power and what kind of influence. And in these techniques, we have to not just say, what's that person? We have to say, what's that person? And with respect to my project, what's their interest? And we as project managers often don't know that. So we need to do the kind of things you're suggesting there, Alinka, but not with our team. We have to go out and we ask stakeholders and say, who else do you think we should talk to? If we're going to do this, if we're going to change the taxi service in this way, who's going to get upset? If we're going to put a new IT system in with new printers and we're going to charge them, who in the organisation cares about this? Who's going to get angry? Who will support us in this? And we have to look beyond our typical project team barriers. So in summary, when we're looking at stakeholders, don't kind of feel, oh, everybody's the same kind of stakeholder. We actually need to differentiate those groups, because differentiating between role-based and agenda-based tells us a lot about, first of all, the techniques we'll use to identify them, and then also about the types of engagement that we're going to be involved with. Definitely.
Yeah, and I think that, overall, it just brings more, I guess, quality and efficiency to the whole, the way the communication flows through the project, because I find that including a lot of people as stakeholders, you end up including them in maybe unnecessary meetings, unnecessary tasks, and you end up in those difficult situations where they're asking, why am I here?
Yes, exactly.
Why was I invited to this, or what's my contribution? What do you need? Just because of that. But also to your point, I think that it would be good to have a role, a specific role, just like an identifier stakeholder role.
Yes.
Because I think managers sometimes, unfortunately, they have so many things to do that they probably do not have the I guess the state of mind to be able to ask all those questions, and they should.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that's one thing that we should keep doing, ask questions.
Absolutely, yes. And I think your point about the role, let's go back to the role-based stakeholders. The most obvious tool to help us understand role-based stakeholders is RACI, Responsibility, Accountability, Consulting, Informed Matrix. Now, lots of people use this, but in its original form, it really was asking the question, not just how do I establish your RACI, but it was actually a way of bringing together an understanding of what your perspective was and what my perspective was of your role. And it's really interesting how often those differ. So you're expecting the sponsor to do this, and they're thinking, I don't know why she's asking me to do that. I didn't think that was part of my job description. So the RACI process is not just about listing out what people do. It's about engaging so that we share a common view of what we think we should be doing. And it amazes me how often if you ever do a test on this, and it's fun to do, is to ask people, what do you think your role is? And there's some simple exercises on this, and then you write down what you think their role is, and it's quite scary how different they can be.
Do you find experience that people actually, that project managers do use consistently the RACI tool, and it becomes, I guess, as you mentioned, an engaging tool rather than pointing out fingers? Because I feel, in my experience, people tend to, they put together the RACI at the beginning of the project, and whenever they bring it up again, if they do, it's more about, hey, who was responsible to do this and did not?
Yes, no, I think you're right.
And they run away from it.
Yeah. And it's actually a really, I mean, RACI is an engagement tool. You're absolutely right. And I'll tell you where I saw this on a very large program. It was PepsiCo Group, I think, had taken over one of our food companies here in South Africa. And there was a very large program, a new digitalization program, and they had a fantastic program manager on it. And I was listening to her story. And one of the things that they did right at the front end, because you can imagine with both a cross-group program plus the complication of a takeover occurring, there was a lot of confusion or potential confusion around the governance structures, who could make what decisions. And they spent a good 3 to 4 months in which all they did is argue in rooms about who was allowed to do what. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean in the sense you were describing, Linka, is that they went down and they said, they put people on the spot and said, well, if this should occur, which of you is going to, who is responsible for this decision then? And quite often there would be 5 people who put their hand up, and then they'd have to work through that process so that right at the beginning of this program, the governance structures had been agreed. And this program was a success. It got stopped partly because of, it got curtailed early, but partly because of the takeover. But one of the things that the organization learned about it was how much value there comes from, particularly on complex programs, in establishing up front who can make what decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think especially as it gets more complex and you have a wider team, then you definitely need to set up some to define the roles more than just what it says in the job description, because otherwise it's just going to get, when things go bad, and they will go bad at some point to some extent, but everybody needs to have their own, I guess, accountability portion and know that this is what I'm taking over, this is what I should be, taking care of and making sure that it goes right.
Yes.
Also, I think it's important to know pretty much what the flow is. I think that's and this is a bit diverting from the topic, but communication flow as to, if this happens or if I come across this, where do I go to or who do I go to? I think that's something that also needs a bit more work in project, rather than just shooting an email to everybody.
And absolutely, the point you made earlier about it being done at the front end is also very important, because in any complex project or program, the roles change or new roles emerge. So it is a revisiting process, which is one of the things about the stakeholder process, which is so important. And the stakeholder process says identify stakeholders first. And it probably shouldn't. It probably should actually say identify candidate stakeholders, or even candidates, or even just people, because that first stage, and often I see projects never get any further than that. They just do an identification, and now those are my stakeholders. But that's not what the stakeholder process says. The stakeholder process says, right, identify and maybe come up with lots of groups of people, but we don't identify who we're going to manage as a stakeholder until we've done the analysis stages, because now we need to analyze them. Are they role-based? Are they gender-based? How important are they to me? Because going back to your other point, you can't actually engage with 200 people. So you're going to have to make decisions like, some of these stakeholders are more salient than others. And if you're dealing with thousands of people, like we see on things like the IRT, then you have to do something which is very important in stakeholder management, which is making decisions about how you're going to group the stakeholders and how you engage with them. So deciding to engage with, let's take the taxi services here, deciding to engage with all taxi drivers, all thousands of them, as one group, isn't necessarily a good thing. You might realize that actually the taxi drivers in Hout Bay are rather different from the taxi drivers in Wynberg or in Plumstead, all these places in Cape Town. And therefore, from a project point of view, it's more sensible to define the groups we deal with geographically, or deal with them by their power positions or deal with them by their attitudes. Maybe we should group them by the positive ones and the negative ones, or maybe we should group them so that we've got some positives with the negatives. So the analysis stage in the stakeholder management process is where we start to identify who we are going to manage as stakeholders, or a word I prefer to use, who are we going to engage with as stakeholders, and how we're going to structure the groupings of that engagement. And I feel that too often on projects, I see project managers who stop after they've done the identification. They haven't gone through the analysis process. And they're then left with a very long list, which isn't as helpful as it ought to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, when do you think is the perfect timing as a project manager to start this process?
Yes, to start it, I think that as soon as you've been appointed, you're going to start to do it to a certain extent. And I think maybe this is a good time also to introduce one of the things that we have to think about as project managers is that not all types of projects are the same. So some projects do have a lot of stakeholders, like the IRT, some programs in particular, and therefore the approach that we'll use is rather different from other types of projects. Now, in my book, I differentiate essentially a continuum from stakeholder neutral. I would argue that every project has stakeholders. But in stakeholder neutral projects, these are relatively low technical based projects in which there are most of the stakeholders are role based, and probably there aren't many agenda based stakeholders at all. All we're really doing is we're defining the product, and then we're communicating and we're giving it out into the project environment, and that's a stakeholder neutral project. Now, what we find in those is that you will start on your stakeholder identification straight away, but you will tend to be using role-based techniques. Who does what? Well, how are they going to do it? How am I going to communicate with them? But then you get into a different type of project where we haven't just got role-based stakeholders, we've got people who are passionate about this project too, and then we're going to have to manage them. And I think I saw that most startlingly when I compared two similar projects I did interview people on. You know, the most common project in the world is project office is office moves. It's the most common project. They do them across the world all the time. So you look at a classic project move, a classic office move. You define where you've got to go to, you talk to the people, make sure you've been communicate with them, you engage with them, you define the products that you need to have in place, like new desks and new computers and all the rest of it. And that's a classic stakeholder neutral project because there are staff out there we're going to communicate with, but we've got a very defined description with them, and we're communicating to let them know when they should move, what's going to happen to them. Now I was faced with a different project, which was Cellnet in the UK, and they were doing a move of 1,000 staff, and the aim of it wasn't simply to move them, it was to create a cultural change. They were going to be moved from a traditional old-style BT environment. If anybody's from the UK, they'll recognise that term. But they used to sit in offices, and they used to go in their offices, and they used to work away in their office. And what this project wanted to do was put them into an open plan environment because it wanted to encourage much more cross-working. It wanted to encourage people to talk to each other. It wanted to set up an environment in which projects would work better together because people weren't hiding away in offices. Now, that's also an office move, but its purpose is not to move people. Its purpose is to create a cultural change with the people that are involved in the office. This is a different kind of stakeholder problem. Now we've got to use gender-based stakeholder techniques. We know there's going to be people don't like moving to didn't want to move to an open plan office. People were worried about trivial things like who would control the air conditioning switch. No, seriously, they were worried about that. and how would I hear without my headphones on? And lots of worries and concerns. And now this is the second layer up, which I described, which is now these are the stakeholder sensitive projects. Now we've got role-based stakeholders. We've also got a lot of agenda-based stakeholders, people who have these different agendas. We don't really know what they are. And now this project manager who was successful, he had to go out there and he had to run workshops to listen to their worries, look at their concerns. He in the end used to buzz people out to the new offices to create almost like a marketing approach, get them excited about the new offices, find out where the blockers are, who the blockers were, and find out how do you influence the blockers when they moved to this new office environment. So this is a different kind of, now coming back to your question, so with this kind of thing, you will again start early on, but you'll use different types of techniques. You'll use both your role-based, but you'll also be worrying about who are the people, and you'll start to do the analysis stage very quickly, because you need to get a good view about how to group these stakeholders. Do you group them? As I said before, in this case, the project manager chose to put together some of the awkward people who were going to be awkward with some of the positives. And what he found was that didn't necessarily work. He had to play with that. He actually found it better to put together all the moaners and let them have a good moaning session. Because they kind of saw through the whole, put them next to some positive people, and they kind of dissed them. So they actually found it was better to group some of the negatives together, allow them to really have an opportunity to express their concerns. And then he formed a group with those. They called them the Maverick stakeholders. Actually, that's what they look like. They formed a group with the Maverick stakeholders to say, "You solve the problem. We've got to get there." So you've identified some really bad problems. How would you deal with those problems? You help us through that process. So by grouping those Maverick stakeholders together, he was able to deal with some of that. So that's our second type of stakeholders. And then the last one, which is interesting, is what I call stakeholder-led. Now, in stakeholder-led projects, which are normally programs, there are so many agenda-based stakeholders that you actually spend your whole time worrying about agenda-based stakeholders. And if I was to give you an example of this, then one of the projects I got involved with in the UK was a prison service project. And what they did there was that they were defining a new approach to dealing with suicides in prisons. In that time, must be 10, 15 years ago now, Britain had the highest suicide rates in prison across the world. I don't know if it's probably not true today, but it was true in those days. And so there was a big program to look at how to deal with these suicide rates. And the program manager came in, and I remember I went to a meeting, and I went into the meeting, and they were chatting away, and they were talking about the client this and the client that. And it took me a while to realize that the client actually was the prisoners. So there was this mindset change they were trying to create amongst the prison warders to change them from thinking about the prisoners as prisoners, the prisoners as clients. So interesting cultural change stuff going on here. Now that was an example of a stakeholder-led program, because there were so many people who felt positive and negative about this. Some government thought this was fantastic. You can imagine some people in the public thought this was a terrible thing to be doing. Prisoners are prisoners and shouldn't be called clients. The prison warders themselves, not clear how positive they felt about treating their prisoners as clients. And what interestingly happened with that project manager is that, or program manager, the first thing she realized is that the work of dealing with agenda-based stakeholders was so large that she was going to do that. And so she brought in another program manager beside her to deal with the running of the projects and the rest of it. And she simply concentrated on the stakeholder engagement processes, because when you get to stakeholder-led projects, they're almost overwhelming in the amount of effort you have to put in to looking after the stakeholders. And you can see how that would affect, you basically become a super political change stakeholder manager. I don't think I've got a name for it. That's what she became.
What was the outcome of this program? Do you happen to know?
I don't know all of it. I believe that the suicide rates did come down. I do know it was a very, very tough program. The program later took over did an excellent job because it's a cultural change. It's a real cultural. But judging by, I mean, there's some English. If there's any English people listening, I apologise because although I am English, I haven't been there for 17 years. Judging by the things we read about the prison service in the UK, I suspect that they're still having problems.
So that sounds challenging. I think you just you brought up a few very, very interesting examples that we really think about maybe in our day-to-day pretty standard projects, I guess.
Yes.
We don't really think that that is a project, and it is very complex to change the mindset in that regard. The analogy that you talked about earlier with office move, with the open space, I've been through a change like that myself, but I was a recent member of the working community, so my mind was fresh. I was coming from university, so I was used to being in an open space. But I saw around me how people's mindset who used to work in offices was so difficult to adapt to the idea of the open space. Yes. I also saw how much when it did, how much they ended up enjoying it, and how much more fun they used to have just because they were all together, and nobody cared about who's controlling the air conditioning.
Right. You have to get through that, don't you? Yes.
The open space, it just became way more engaging, and something that I think really worked. So in that company, there were different departments, and everybody was in the open space. There was no more separation. What really worked was putting together people working on, I guess, having similar agendas as to what they're working on. So, for example, if there was a product, it was a pharmaceutical company. So if there was a product that was about to go on the market, they would have people working on different elements on that project. So, for example, sales, regulatory, governance, medical, safety, and all those kind of team members, they were pretty much the project or the product team members that were sitting close to each other. And that brought a lot of efficiency and teamwork in what they were doing, because they didn't really have to move from one side of the building to the other to get. Sometimes they weren't doing that, and they were just sending an email, which may have been misinterpreted. Whereas if they were just all together at the same, let's say, table, they could just speak through it. So they became people tended to have. I noticed they started having a bit more emphasis on just communicating in person instead of using emails and other tools. So it was interesting. It was definitely interesting.
Yes. And the example there you're using, of course, also comes back to this. I mean, project managers can have a major impact on a project by the way we structure the project. And that is also true in stakeholder engagement. We can have a major impact upon the quality of our stakeholder engagement by the way we put those groupings together, like the ones you're describing there, Anka. So it's an interesting debate as to whether we impose groupings on our stakeholders or we allow stakeholders to tell us how they want to be grouped. As you go into stakeholder-led projects, you can't really tell them how to be grouped. You have to let them tell you because they're so powerful. They have so much power. But a lot of the projects that most of us are working on, which is in that middle area, in the stakeholder sensitive area, then we do have a role to try and group people appropriately to allow them to engage and to allow us to make that engagement successful. And that's a really important part of stakeholder management for sure.
When do you think a project would be categorized as stakeholder-led? Is that more so for bigger projects just because of the number?
I think there's, I mean, normally they're programs. And there are a couple of things that you'll notice about stakeholder-led projects. If you're running in a stakeholder neutral project, then your mindset tends to be define the products, scope the project by the products, and define the product. Just do what you're supposed to be delivering. It's a delivery-based view. In stakeholder-led projects, you don't take that view. You don't define the products. You say, who are the stakeholders? And it's the stakeholders that define the scope for the project. That's a very different mindset. So if you're finding yourself in a project where it's more to do with the stakeholders, I'm going to have to look after HR, and we're going to be doing work with them on the new AI processes or whatever it is. Where we're defining our project by the stakeholders, we're more in a stakeholder-led approach. Where we define it by products, we're in a more stakeholder neutral, and stakeholder sensitive is in that middle area in between, and that's why we sometimes get caught out. So if you're in a stakeholder sensitive and you define it by products, you're going to really irritate the agenda-based stakeholders. If you only do it by stakeholders, you're not going to get your delivery done. So that's often why, as project managers, we find ourselves quite stressed in that middle portion, because you've got to do a bit of both. And you've got to recognize when you should be doing more stakeholder or more product delivery types of approaches. But typically, stakeholder-led is a program. If you take the new road transport system in Cape Town, the project I talked about, the taxi drivers, was one stream in a multiple program. So you've got a stream which is doing the technical road build, you've got a stream which is looking after tourists, you've got a stream which is looking after taxi drivers. And what happens is each of these streams have their own success factors. In the case of the taxi drivers, it's implement the taxis, make the taxi drivers happy, and make sure they don't burn the buses when we put them out there. Literally, that's what we're trying to do. Whereas somebody else, the road people, are just worrying about getting the tarmac down. And what happens is that those different streams conflict, and the program has to deal with conflicts between the streams, which is classic in a program environment. So if you're in stakeholder-led, probably because you're part of the program and you've been given the job of dealing with this massive number of agenda-based stakeholders, like in the prison service, for example.
Yeah. How is this project happening in Africa? How is the progress? Is it done? The one with the road system?
Yes, it is. The IoT was a big success for FIFA. And there have been, actually, the City of Cape Town has done some amazing projects. If you follow the IMO Global Awards at all, then the City of Cape Town 2 years ago was voted the best team in Africa, but it was also a really high. It's the projects it's doing over 1,000 municipalities. It's doing over 1,000 projects, billions of rand, and these projects are really complex. And fortunately, I have access to them. I use quite a lot of their projects on my MSCs for case studies. But the one I'm doing at the moment with them, when I say doing, they're talking to me and I'm going to use as a case study. And that's that great thing that we've talked about in the past, the links between academia and business, is we are looking at how they set up the COVID immunization centres in sports centres and how they managed to do that. And also how they managed to get nurses to work during COVID. And there were some fantastic projects done around that, and award-winning projects. I think the one to do with the COVID immunization centres, award-winning project. So there's some really interesting stuff going on in those areas. And it's great that I can now, I'm going out in January, and I'm going to go and meet the project managers, and we'll write that up as a case. And I've given my MSc students a hint. Next year, we will be probably doing your assignment on how the COVID immunization centres how do you run a project to do that.
That's amazing. I think that, as a side note, I think that the work that you're doing within the research of project management is also very important. I think there's not much out there still. Yeah, I think that's something that is definitely something we need to do. Kudos to you and others, just because you're persevering in this area. Probably a lot of work, but I think that we all benefit.
Let's go back to stakeholders for a second, and maybe even my book. Actually, that might be a good place to go back to, because my book is currently in second edition, and part of the reason it's in second edition is because the person who I work with, Professor Tim Kloppenberg, he was a professor at Xavier University in America, and he probably 3 years ago now said, okay, we need to update our book series to bring in Agile. So he came to me and said, Louise, we need to talk about Agile in stakeholders. Now, I don't know what your view would be about that, but my first thing was, for goodness sake, it's the same. It's no different. Whether you're in an Agile project or whatever, it's the same. There's still stakeholders. But he was very persistent. And I think there were a few things that came out from looking at what was happening around this. The first thing is Agile does some really interesting things around stakeholders. The first thing it does is it really attempts to bring our role-based stakeholders closer to the project. So you think about the product owner role, then what we attempt to do is we attempt to bring our business stakeholders into the project. We make them part of the process, which is incredibly important. And I think it's a really valuable thing that we see in Agile. And I saw a good example of that with a retail group who their warehouse had been burned down, and it was like September and Christmas was coming, so they needed this place back up again, and they couldn't think of any way of doing it in that time. And one of the decisions the project manager made is to bring one of the directors, I think it was the second in command. They brought one of the directors into no, let me stop there because I just seen a note about the mic. I'm going to try something to see if we can get it to work. I'm either going to move my mic or maybe Alinka, if we've got.
Hi, can you still hear me?
Yep.
Good. Let's try it like that and see if that helps. So yes, so on this particular one, the program, what they did is they brought the director onto the field. They actually built him a caravan, and they put him in the caravan, and he was there for 4 months, because that way, every time a problem came up, he could resolve it and he could solve the decision. So he was actually there, and that's very like what Agile suggests we do about the product owner role, is bring our role-based stakeholders much closer in, particularly when they're involved in the decision-making process. So that's something I think we need to think of in the future about our stakeholders, particularly where they're involved in decision-making. We need to bring them closer. And then the other thing Agile does is it doesn't talk about jobs, it talks about at best roles. And it kind of says, it's not you're the project manager and you're the sponsor and you're this. It's more, we have this team. We should take on the roles which are most appropriate to our capabilities and the needs of the project, which is a very important part of our projects nowadays. And then the third thing that we see is the real emphasis on collaborative practices in Agile. And that's something, many of the things we've talked about, Alinka, the collaborative practices become a very important part of the way that we run projects. So maybe putting an Agile Agile chapter in was a good idea. We'll see. If you happen to look at the book, tell me whether you think Agile is actually different when it comes to stakeholders.
Yeah, no, for sure we'll do, and I think it's definitely a current topic as I hear. So of course, and so this was the addition to the first edition, I guess, and also the reason for having a second edition. I assume it's just that the first edition was a lot of success. So congratulations.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but it was a very nice opportunity to look at that point of view. So it was very good. I think the last thing I just stakeholders like to mention, because you can't talk about stakeholders without talking about communication, and we did go out, or I went out and talked to our stakeholders about what they did in communication. And we looked at 6 things that they did, and one of them I think is really important, and you referred to it when you were talking about your office move stuff, is that sometimes you've got to persuade stakeholders. Sometimes your communication, your engagement you're doing is because you need to persuade stakeholders to come on the journey with you. And I think that's one of the techniques that we as project managers need to is influence, persuade. And if you haven't read Cialdini's book on the psychology of persuasion, I definitely recommend it. But many of my case studies looked at what techniques were used to persuade people who didn't necessarily want to do this, like your office people. What techniques were used to persuade them and to influence them to say, yes, okay, this looks interesting. And these are techniques, I think, around influence, around leadership, that are very important for us as managers.
I guess that's probably when knowing their agendas is important.
Yes,
That's
yeah,
probably
absolutely.
persuasion.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I mean, I think that those are great points. I actually wanted to ask you, if you're not doing it, maybe you want to talk about some workshops on the stakeholder project management, just for everybody out there who's really in need of your insights. These are really good pointers that you gave us today.
What was the beginning of your question, Alenka?
Do you have any? Do you have any? I guess presentation or talks about stakeholder-led project management outside of your academic work?
Yes, there's a couple of my talks I like them are on YouTube, so you can have a look at me on YouTube. But I've also published a course on, because often stakeholder management is done as part of something else. So I rarely nowadays, I occasionally get asked to run a workshop on stakeholder management, but often what I get asked to do is leadership or program management. So on Udemy, there is a course on program management, which looks at stakeholders. And that also, because you can't do program management without doing stakeholder management, that also is part of the things that you can do on that. And this is not quite answering your question, but I was very excited this year that one of the Business Expert Press, who are the publishers of my book, they cross academia and business. And one of the leadership schools in America, and I can't remember which one, has adopted based they use it on the course. So I developed learning materials to support them in delivering that. So they have the case studies, they have some of the slides and things like that, and some videos. So I've also been doing that with universities where they want to bring that into their particularly leadership courses, because that seems to be where a lot of stakeholder interest is coming up now.
That's part of the initiative that you were mentioning earlier. Yes, and for our audience, Louise is also one of our key board of directors or advisory boards in the PMO leader community. She's the main part of your contribution here is exactly this, right? The bridging the gap between academia and business.
Yes, absolutely. And any listeners, please, if that's something, one of the things we've been doing the last 2 months is putting together essentially a package by which people in our PMO can go to the universities to say, maybe we could do some collaboration. So we're putting together a package which you could use to find your universities to say, maybe there is something here to work with. I've been trialing out in South Africa. I've already found the university, actually found even in my own university, I didn't realize there was PMO research going on. So that was very helpful. And I've also then found that we have put that onto the research committee. And some of the ideas have come from the PMO leaders in terms of things that they would like to know about. We're now going to be able to feed into student research projects to say, would you be interested in this because we're interested in it? So that's part of the process. We're trialing it now. And then what we hope to do is reach out to the community next year to say, look, as this is something you're interested in, let us help you get that connection between business and academia, particularly in PMOs, getting going again.
Yeah, and I'd like to get Canadian universities on board with that too. So we can talk about this afterwards. Because
absolutely, and Canada's done some of the best research in PMOs.
Well, that's great to hear. Yeah. Is there anything else, Louise, that you want to leave the audience with? And to leave it, we're almost up to the top of the hour.
I think the big message that I wanted to get over in my book is that so often everybody I talk to in projects says that stakeholder engagement is important. We all agree with that. And I think we just need to question ourselves and say, if we think it's so important, what are we doing about it? What are you doing differently? If you run a stakeholder sensitive project, which many of you are, it's going to be different. And what are you doing differently? And that would be my kind of leaving message. What are we doing differently?
That's amazing. And I think that's a good question for us to ask ourselves each day. What are you doing?
Yes.
This is how we evolve, I guess. Louise, this was really a really insightful conversation. Really, thank you for taking the time in your evening to come and join us and give us snippets of your book and your experience. And for the audience, you have a link to the book on Amazon. If you're curious, go ahead and check it out. The recording is going to be available right after we close this webinar for everybody who's a PMO leader member of the community. Have access to it right, and everything is free in the PMO leader like you're used to. So if you're not a member, you can just join. That's also free, and you have access to a lot of great resources like this webinar with Louise and many other tools within this community. It's really an interesting place to be. I personally have been part of it for the past 2.5 years, maybe even more, and it's as refreshing as again. There's so many more things that are being hatched as we speak. So that's always nice to feel rewarded in what we do as project managers. So going back to Louise, thank you again for coming. Hope to hear more about your projects and how you managed to bridge the gap between academia and business, and we'll be on the lookout for you.
Thank you, Alinka. Thank you so much for having me.
It was our pleasure. Have a wonderful holiday season, and that goes to everybody. Whatever you are celebrating, it will be a change in the year for everybody at least. So enjoy. We will resume the episode starting with January. We'll get more info on our social media on LinkedIn. And in the meantime, I will just leave you with a see you soon, and have a great rest of your day and evening.
Bye now. Bye now.